So you bought your first hardware synth to incorporate into your setup. First of all, I would like to say congratulations. I think hardware can help you to improve your knowledge about synthesis and allow you to experiment on a deeper level. Tactile control is the way to go. With all the advantages of hardware though, there are also some problems you will encounter. Please keep watching and let me help you detect and overcome these issues. Hi, this is Frederick from the techno label Detroit, Berlin. Last week I got an email from one of our dear followers, Gary. He bought his first hardware synthesizer and is seeking help in adjusting his workflow. He has some other questions too, which I will answer later in this episode. If you want to be notified when upcoming videos get published, please subscribe and hit the bell button. At 1,000 subscribers, I'll do a full studio tour. Where do I start? Let's have a look at an in-the-box workflow and take it as an example. So you have a computer with an audio interface connected and your DAW of choice. If you don't have an audio interface, you might need one. To get you started, I'll put a few cheap ones and the interface which I prefer in the description below. Most built-in computer audio interfaces won't get you good results in capturing the audio from your synth. How much you will need to adjust your workflow is all depending on your current workflow. The connections and caveats aside, the hardware synth isn't that different from a software synth. The biggest workflow affecting difference will be saving and loading your project. With software only, you save and that's it. When you reopen your project, you'll be back where you left off. A hardware incorporated setup though, if you don't print a tape, you'll need to find other ways to sync the state of your hardware to your project. You could do this manually or with program changes, but in my opinion that complicates things and I personally like to print to tape. In other words, record the audio from your device to your project. You lose the ability of being able to tweak things indefinitely, but that can be viewed as a plus and speeds up your workflow. So let's say your current workflow consisting of using a linear arrangement view like the session view in Ableton Live or most arranging views in other DAWs. You build your tracks perhaps with a couple of loops and software synths which have a chain of plugins on top of them before everything gets sent to the in-the-box mixer. When your track is finished, you press export and you call it a wrap. Now let's connect the hardware synth and have a look at a plausible workflow. Most important things to know about your synth are: how do you control your synth? MIDI, MIDI over USB, control voltages or just by keyboard? And what audio options does your synth have? Analog audio, digital audio outputs or audio over USB? Even if you're able to hook up your device with only one USB cable, only when your synth supports both audio and MIDI over USB, the way you control and get audio from your synth is by setting up two different channels in your project. One containing MIDI note data sent to the synth, the other one to record incoming audio too. You could do with only one if your synth has a sequencer built in, but you'll need to feed it a clock signal to have it synced. The synth we are connecting doesn't have its own sequencer, so we'll add a MIDI channel in our DAW. Let's for the moment refer to it as a MIDI track. The synth has MIDI over USB, so we just plug it in and it should appear as a selectable MIDI device. If your synth doesn't support MIDI over USB, you'll need a MIDI converter too, unless your audio interface has one built in. To make things complicated, a synth can be sent data to over 16 different MIDI channels. Make sure the receiving channel and the channel you select to send data over matches. These channels has nothing to do with the number of the channel or, as we refer to it, track in your DAW. If your synth, like this one, doesn't support audio over USB, you'll need an audio interface to record the audio from your synth to a channel in your DAW. There are other benefits of using an audio interface, like adding guitar pedals or hardware effects to your audio chain. Try connecting your audio interface directly to your computer. Avoid connecting it to a hub if possible. When your audio interface is connected and set up, you can plug the audio out of your synth into input of your interface and set it up. In your project you can add an audio channel and select the audio input your synth is connected to. All should be good to go, but first we need to talk about something important. Entering the realm of hardware synths, you'll encounter one of the most annoying foes out there. This one is called latency, the thing many others and I hate most about recording. Envision this. You send MIDI notes via a MIDI instrument in your DAW to an external synth over MIDI, which reads the note data information and sends back audio over an analog connection to your audio interface, which then converts the analog audio to digital audio and sends it to a channel in your DAW. This process takes up a tiny little bit of time. Not much, but enough to get you very annoyed. The recorded audio sounds off. Not musical at all. If you keep adding stuff this way, your project will become a mess in no time and you'll never get the timing right. So it's very important you correct each layer of audio recorded before you advance to the next. One important thing to mention is to always use direct monitoring when recording audio and mute the channel in your DAW to prevent a chorus-like effect. By direct monitoring, you'll hear the audio without latency, instead of the audio that's actually being recorded. There are multiple ways to correct the latency. You can adjust the latency settings in your DAW, but depending on your DAW, the results can vary. Let's take a look at the latency settings in Ableton Live and go through some examples. Let's first take a look at the setup. We have a STREICHFETT string synthesizer, we have our audio interface and we have our computer. The STREICHFETT, it has a USB for syncing, not for audio. It's not audio over USB, so for audio we must go through our audio interface to our computer. I took the Zoom H4 for the moment. I have a better sound card at my production station, but for this video I'll do a small setup and I'll use the Zoom H4 as my audio interface. I don't recommend you use it as an audio interface, but for this purpose, to show you the video, I will do so. From the STREICHFETT there are two outputs. We have a stereo output. There are two mono jacks. This is a balanced jack. I don't remember if it's balanced or not balanced, but to be sure I just took a balanced 1/4 inch jack. It has a tip, a ring and a sleeve. You can look at the black rings, and if there are two rings then it's a balanced jack. If there's just one, it's a tip sleeve jack. Take a look at an unbalanced jack. It has just one black ring and it's called a TS 1/4 inch jack. It's 1/4 inch in size and it's tip sleeve, so that's the TS. The balanced ones is the tip ring sleeve. We have MIDI out, but like I said, we have the MIDI over USB to sync it, to send note data to the hardware synthesizer. I don't use those MIDI in and outs, but if you have to do so with older machines and such, then you can use a MIDI cable. What I told you about the channels, you need two of them. I have the MIDI channel and the audio channel. So the MIDI channel, it's configured with some note data. You can look at the note data, it's just 1/4 notes. so that we can see if the synthesizer is perfectly in time. I have a short attack, a short decay on the synthesizer with quite an aggressive sound, so I can hear the attack well, so I can check if it's all in time. The MIDI channel, MIDI 2, you have to put it to STREICHFETT. This is a plug-and-play device. It will automatically show up when connected as STREICHFETT. You may want to check the settings. If you go to the settings, there are some MIDI settings and input-output MIDI ports. It's the STREICHFETT. I put track on both of them and sync on both of them. It's not necessarily, but output it should be on sync if you want MIDI clock to be sent to the synthesizer. We have 16 channels like I mentioned. The synthesizer is on channel 1, receiving data on channel 1. If I put it on channel 2, it will probably do nothing. It's not multitimbral. Multitimbral is that it's actually layers of synthesizers, like on channel 1 you have a synthesizer engine, on channel 2 you have a synthesizer engine, but this one it's not multitimbral, so it only receives MIDI data on one channel. You can set it up that it will receive MIDI data on channel 16 perhaps, but in this scenario we just go for channel 1. If you want to send some data to multitimbral synthesizers, you can add many MIDI channels as the synth is capable of. You can have channel 1, 2, 3 and 4, and the synthesizer can be set up to receive that data on those channels, and you will actually have like 4 synthesizers sending audio to your computer. But like I said, this is not multitimbral, so it won't work with this synthesizer. It only has one channel. We have the MIDI channel with note data sending to the synthesizer over USB. Then we have an audio channel made. These are receiving from input 1 and 2. We are monitoring this, but we are also muting this. So we have a direct input. Actually, no, I don't think we're muting it. No. With my audio interface that supports direct monitoring, I will mute this and I will hear the audio exactly when it plays. Now, because of the limitations of the Zoom H4, and that's also a reason why I don't recommend using the H4 as an audio interface, it doesn't have direct monitoring. We'll always hear some kind of delay when playing back the audio. So it receives at channel 1 and 2 the audio in, and then it's sent to the master. This sends MIDI data, note data to the synthesizer, and then we receive audio on the other channel. What I did here, we have the 2 channels and I made a third one just to show how a plug-in synthesizer, this is just a 606 hi-hat. I will play this and compare it to the latency which you will get from the synthesizer. Mainly also because it's not directly monitoring, but you will hear it with the delay. The delay will be the same as when you record, and it's a little bit late. It will be late in the track. With direct monitoring, you will hear it instantly, but it will be recorded with some latency. The same latency when not direct monitoring. So it's quite complex, but eventually we'll get there. I'll show you the settings, all you need to know. So taking a look at the audio preferences, we have the latency with the buffer size, calculated in and output latency, the driver error compensation, which you will actually need to change the latency settings, the way you perceive the latency when recording, and then the overall latency, which is actually the in and the output latency combined. The buffer size, you can choose a very small size, and what that does, it will directly output the audio with very little delay, but it will have an immense load on your computer. That's with plugins, with recorded audio. It will need a lot of power to calculate it to be sent right out. If you put a bigger buffer size, like 512 samples or 2408 samples of buffer size, then you will actually delay the audio a little bit so that it has more time to calculate everything and it will have a lesser load on your computer. If you have a small buffer size and you experience dropouts and things not syncing right, then you just enlarge the buffer size and you will be probably fine. For this example, we have the biggest buffer size available. You will see input latency is close to 43 and output latency is close to 45 milliseconds. Overall latency is calculated right below 90 milliseconds. And 90 milliseconds, you can really hear that. I have a clip with a plug-in instrument. I will play this first. You will notice a little bit of latency, but not that much. It's still all in the computer. It plays it back. It's quite on top of each other. But because it's a bigger buffer size, it can sound, in my opinion, a little bit unmusical. It's fluctuating a little bit. If you put a lower buffer size, it will be more fluent. Because a computer clock is not the most stable clock available. And also the Zoom which I'm using can't use that clock. Can buy clocks to clock everything. A separate clock will cost you hundreds of euros or hundreds of dollars. It's quite okay. So let me stop this. Metronome is still going. We'll do the same, but we'll play the MIDI data to the STREICHFETT synthesizer. And you will hear an immense shift of synchronization. So this is way off. It will come late. It will fluctuate. It's not in time. Let me pause it right there. Go to the buffer size and put it really low. So I have 32 samples of buffer size. Calculated, this means a little less than 1 millisecond of input delay and like 3.5 seconds of output delay, which is close to an overall latency of about 4.5 milliseconds. I will play it back again and you will hear that it's almost in time. This is a lot better, but it's also putting much more load onto my computer. If I combine it with the plugin, which will put more load on the computer, I will see from 6% to 12 and 13% CPU usage. This is the biggest difference. I'll pause it and I go back to the high sample rate settings, like 2048. It will again have the latency. It will be not in time. The plugin will be almost in time, but the audio signal coming back from the STREICHFETT, it will be all over the place. So now I have put a bigger buffer size, and instead of reaching 12 at 13% of CPU usage, this has dropped to 7% of CPU usage. So the buffer size, it actually does a lot. Now we'll go back to the settings and we'll adjust the driver error compensation. If we adjust this, the overall latency also will change because we're actually compensating for the latency. So the driver compensation, it's about the same amount as the overall latency, which we had when this was at 0. So with minus 88 milliseconds of driver error compensation, we have less than 1/2 of a millisecond overall latency. So we'll hop back to our little test here, and you will hear that it's not that musical, but it's quite in time. So it's quite okay, but I feel that it's not that musical. It's right on top, but it's like shifting a little bit because you have the big buffer and the timing will be not 100%. Let me stop and go back to a very small buffer size. With a lot of plugins and audios, you will probably not be able to put that low buffer size in there because the computer will be not capable of processing it on time. What this means is when your computer is not able, your computer will crash or will experience slowdown. Live is an exception to most DAWs. Live, they just lower the quality of the audio in order to compensate and not crash, because that's what's live for. Not crashing the software in order when you perform live you can really not have such things happen. In Logic this is different. You will experience a crash or just everything stopping and giving an error. Logic, it will always maintain the same audio quality output. Buffer size, it will depend, but mostly you will be at 128 or 512 or something in these ranges. But let me first put it on a very small buffer size and let's go back and do the same test. And this is quite okay. This is actually almost perfect. So with these settings, with very low buffer sizes and the driver error compensation, probably it will be called differently in other DAWs, but you can find these settings at the latency settings. The STREICHFETT is actually playing back well. Let's record a little bit. Okay, and now I'll see monitoring like this, and it's really good. It's very close to the exact starting point. So what I always do, I record a metronome when recording a hardware synthesizer, an external metronome, so I can just put it on the one and I'll be good to go. So let's do it. Set 1 here, and this is perfect now. So the 1 comes on the 1. If you do it with latency, let me go back. Let's put the monitoring on. Go back to the buffer size. Put this on 0, so we have close to 90 milliseconds of latency. Let's record another clip. So this is all over the place. If we zoom in, you will see the difference. We had 1 on 512. We will do the same with this one. Zoom in all the way to 1 on 512 scale, like this. So this is the difference in latency. So when I play this back, let me shut down the hi-hat. This is really coming behind in time. This is not musical, this is way off. If we play back the corrected one, it's right on top. It was here, it was close, but we put the one there and that's perfect. The right buffer size and latency compensation are key elements in getting your hardware synth running in time. One trick to lessen the load on your CPU when choosing a smaller buffer size is to manually disable some effects channels. You can activate them when going back to bigger buffer sizes. I personally prefer to manually adjust the position of the recorded clips. I multitrack as much as possible. Afterwards, I zoom in all the way, select the newly recorded lines of audio and align them to the grid of the project. When recording extra layers, I record a metronome on a separate channel too. It makes it way easier to get the newly recorded tracks aligned and helps me get the sync right. Another way to deal with latency problems is to use your synth just as a sound source to sample from. But even then, you'll need to process the recorded sounds and trim the clips to make them align correctly and get the starting point right. Let's have a look at the last steps of incorporating hardware synths to your workflow and start producing. As with software synthesizers, you'll need no data on your MIDI track, data which the synth will play back. You can also program parameter automation if your synth supports it. If you have a synth with a keyboard or knobs and you want to record the MIDI data, you can, if you set up the incoming MIDI data signal. But you want to make sure your synth settings are set to local off, otherwise you get a MIDI feedback. When you have a nice melody going and everything sounds the way you wanted it to sound, it's time to start recording, or as I prefer to call it, print to tape. This way you can apply some software plugins and effects on the recorded audio. It's also a necessary step before you'll be able to export your project to a playable audio format like a WAV, an AIF or an MP3. You should always make sure you have all hardware synth parts recorded onto their respective channels. The way you use your synthesizer is all up to you. It certainly has a steep learning curve to it when setting it all up for the first time. There are many videos on this topic out there. I hope mine gave you some basic understanding on how to incorporate your hardware synthesizer into your production workflow. I promise to answer Gary's other questions, so here I go. What does your workflow look like, and do you record jams where you only keep the best parts? Honestly, it's quite complex. I have many hardware synths and they're set up so I'm able to produce tracks and do hardware-only live sets. Actually, the computer is set up as a recording and production platform, sending sync to the hardware, but I can also send sync from an external MIDI clock to be able to rehearse live sets without the need of a computer. I also record hardware synths to use as samples in hardware sequencers. After I make the body of the track on the hardware sequencer, I record it back into my DAW to finish the track and post-process it. Most of my productions start out as multi-track jams, which are cleaned up a little bit and post-processed in the end. Should you have questions about this topic, I'll be glad to answer them or do a follow-up video. More videos will follow soon, so if you're new to the channel, please feel free to hit that like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching.